Good evening everyone gathered here. We, the team of Mural Lectures, the official lecdem body of IIT Madras, established in 1982, warmly welcome you to a lecture on India and the middle income trap. I humbly request the audience to keep their mobile phones on silent mode to avoid any disturbances. Today, we have with us Dr. Indermit Gill, Chief Economist of the World Bank Group and Senior Vice President for Development Economics. Dr. Gill is renowned expert in economics and development with an extensive background in academia and policy making. Dr. Gill's illustrious career spans across leading institutions such as Duke University, Georgetown University, and the University of Chicago. He has made significant contributions to the field of economics, particularly through his work on sovereign debt vulnerabilities, green growth, labor markets, poverty, and inequality. During his tenure at the World Bank, Dr. Gill has played a pivotal role in shaping the institution's response to the various challenges faced by the developing economies, including the recent global shocks. Notably, he led the World Bank's influential 2009 World Development Report on Economic Geography, introducing concepts such as middle income trap. His expertise and insights are invaluable for anyone interested in understanding the complexities of global economic development and the strategies needed to overcome hurdles on the path to prosperity. Sir, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude for accepting our invitation and would like to welcome you to our campus. Now, I would like to invite Professor Basavarajan, Faculty Advisor of EML team, to facilitate Dr. Indermit Gill with an Angavastram. Dr. Soumik Lal with an Angavastram. Now I hand over the charge of the session to our guest, Dr. Indermit Gill and Dr. Soumik Lal.
It's a pleasure to be here in Chennai. I came to Chennai, so I think I was about 7 or 8 years old. So this is my second visit to Chennai. My first visit, all I remembered was the ocean because it was the first time that I had ever seen the ocean. I had no idea that there was this beautiful campus here with such smart people and such a storied history. But I do know about IIT Madras now, and I'll go back with really good memories. So what I'm going to do actually today is first to thank you all for being here. I know that it's in the middle of a very busy time for you. I know that you have exams coming up next week. So thank you very, very much. We won't take too much time. We'll make sure that we get all of our messages in within 1 hour, and that includes questions and answers from you. So our plan is this. Our plan is to talk about, so I thought that I would tell you about 3 things. I'll tell you a little bit about the World Bank Group, because I think in general there is, so I'm sure that you all are smart people and you know a lot about everything, but there may be some things that you don't know about the World Bank, and it'll be nice if you get to know more. The second thing, actually, I'm going to ask my colleague Soumik Lal, who's the director of the World Development Report. That's the main report of the World Bank every year. And he's the director of the 2024 World Development Report, and it's called the Middle Income Trap. And the findings of that report are especially, are quite important for a country like India, right? So we weren't actually going to talk a lot about India, but what we can do is that in the question and answers, you can ask us questions about India and so on. We also have a third colleague here. So his name is Dr. Cruz, and he is actually based in Delhi. He's the World Bank's chief economist for India. Yeah? Okay. Now, so I'll tell you a little bit about the World Bank. And the World Bank is one of 3 Bretton Woods organizations. The other 2 are the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, as you know. And these 3 organizations were started in 1944 or so. And one of them looks at the international flows of money. The second one is supposed to look at the progress of economic development, and then the third one oversees trade across the world, right? So that's the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, right? And all 3 of these organizations have actually received quite a bit of criticism, and these criticisms come from the experiences of Africa, of Latin America, and of East Asia and South Asia with these institutions. Right? So I'm not going to take very long on this one because I know Shomik has a lot of new things to show you. These are old things that I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you about the past. He's going to tell you about the future. Yeah. So during the interwar period, which is between 1918 and 1938, there were these 3 big problems. The first was a lot of inflation, hyperinflation in Germany, for example. And the second one, which was related, were lots of economic problems. So Germany was forced to pay reparations to the other countries because of the First World War. And then you had the Great Depression in the 20s. And then after that, these were times of rampant poverty in all parts of the world, including Europe. Right? So then what happened was that there was destruction during the Second World War, and that was not something that was just restricted to Europe. So that's one big lesson, by the way. The big lesson that actually comes from that is that when you see problems in one part of the world and you think that those problems will not affect you, generally you would be wrong, because the world tends to be interconnected. Even more than 60, 70 years back, it was interconnected, right? So when these European powers went to war with each other, everybody got involved, including India. You had Indian troops fighting all over the world and so on. So it was everything. Now, what happened was that there was a lot of destruction, and there was a threat of communism, in the sense that because people were unsatisfied with the capitalist system, because the capitalist system had led to all of those problems that we are talking about. So in fact, because of all of these reasons, the powers that had won the Second World War, minus Russia, right? The other powers all got together in a place called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA, and this conference was led by the US and the UK. Okay? And it was mainly the US that got its way, because if you remember, the US was not devastated by war, right? It had actually come out on the victorious side, but it had not been bombed like the UK and like other parts of Europe. So that in some sense, the Bretton Woods period was a shift in power from the Europeans being the global superpower, right, like the US, France, Spain, and others. And there was a shift from that to the US becoming the big power, and you had the other big power was the USSR then, right? Okay. So by the way, India also sent a delegation. And so it had, apparently, if you read up on the history, it's very interesting. India's 2 objectives were, the first one was to make sure that Britain paid its debt to India, because India had loaned money to the UK to fight the war. And India was afraid that the UK would not pay its debt. So it went there mainly for that reason, and UK's war debt was paid to India. And then the other one was so even back then, India was worried that China would get a much larger power in these organizations, So partly it was to counter that as well. And of course, India also knew that it had just become independent and it had huge financing needs, massive financing needs. Okay, so this was the original proposal. There were going to be these three things. So one was going to be the International Monetary Fund. It would be like the RBI for the world. Okay, so when a bank got into trouble, you go to the RBI. When a country would get into trouble, it would go to the International Monetary Fund. The second one was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That was the first name of the World Bank, by the way. It was shortened to just the World Bank at the time. But part of the job was not just development. Remember, it was also reconstruction. So even though the ideas initially was to reconstruct Europe, there were others like India and others who wanted it also to look at, also wanted it to finance not just the reconstruction of Europe, but the development of the world. Okay? And then the third one, like I said, was the International Trade Organization. It was called that in the original proposals. Now, so I'll quickly tell you what the International Monetary Fund is, what the World Bank is, and what the WTO is. So at this time, what had happened was that countries had fixed exchange rates. So the amount that you could get of, let's say, dollars for a rupee was fixed. It was not traded on the markets. So it would not change that much unless the government changed it, right? What this usually meant was that if you set the price of your currency too high, then what would happen is that you would end up with a huge deficit. Okay? You would import more than you could export, so you would end up with a huge deficit of foreign currencies. And then if you did that long enough, you would not be able to repay your foreign currency debt. At that point, the IMF would actually be the one to help you out. It would say, okay, we will lend you this foreign currency, and you can pay the debt. But you have to try to see why you accumulated such a big deficit. So you would need to change some things in your policies and so on, and the IMF would recommend what policies you needed to change. So India went to the IMF mostly just once. It was in the early 90s. This was when India got into trouble and so on. And as a result of that, so that India found to be a very humiliating experience, because you actually have foreigners coming and telling you, you can't manage your own economy, you have to do it like this and so on. And it's not a coincidence that India has done rather well since then. Okay. Right? So it's worth your while actually just Googling the IMF and seeing how it works and so on. But it's like the RBI. Yeah. Okay. Then you had the World Trade Organization, and part of the problem was that part of the problems in Europe were also that there was a lot of trade disputes between countries. So, for example, say that a country wasn't doing particularly well and so on, it would try to put restrictions on trade. Or if it wanted to do better thing, it would put restrictions, it would put tariffs on the imports from other countries and so on, and this would lead to tariffs from the other side and so on, and this would lead to less trade and more disputes, right? So the aim of the WTO was to actually try to prevent these disputes, so that you didn't do unfair trade practices. Okay? And back then, by the way, the US, it was not supportive of the International Trade Organization. And like I told you, it was the US that was really deciding what should be done, what was the design of these institutions and so on. So there wasn't a World Trade Organization at that time. So there was a World Bank and there was an IMF. It was set up then, but the World Trade Organization was not set up then. Instead, there was an interim arrangement. It was called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Okay? It was called the GATT, G-A-T-T. And the GATT was what later on became the World Trade Organization, not the ITO, but it was called the World Trade Organization. And so the US has generally been actually quite critical also of the WTO. Okay? Now, but the main organization I want to tell you about quickly is the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group has become a group because initially, though, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, it was supposed to sort of focus on this reconstruction. India actually, India was quite instrumental in the design of IBRD too, to actually also finance international development. And the IBRD is like a bank. It's just like any bank, okay, except that it's for the world. What it does is it borrows money on international markets, like in New York and Tokyo and Frankfurt, etc. And it then lends that money to countries that want to finance long-term development projects. It lends to those countries at that interest rate that the World Bank paid, and plus a small markup, right? So this way, these countries, they would not be able to borrow themselves on these markets, but they could borrow through the World Bank. So the World Bank was basically intermediating funds from rich countries to poorer countries to finance development. Then, a few years later, there was a call to actually have, so the World Bank would only lend to governments. It would not lend to the private sector in these countries and so on. So if you were a firm in India, you would not get cheap credit from the World Bank. It would only be the Indian government which would get this cheaper credit. So there was a need felt that there should also be something that would lend to companies in poorer countries, that would invest in these companies and so on. So that's the International Finance Corporation. And the International Finance Corporation essentially is like a big impact investor. Okay, so essentially what it tries to do is it tries to sort of help firms that need money, and they pick firms in a way that this would help the development of the country at the same time. So it's not just that firm that's going to be helped, it's the country as a whole. Now, after that, around, so about 16 years after the IBRD was set up, there was a realization that for some countries, they were so poor that even the rates, even the concessional rates of IBRD were too high. They could not afford to repay these loans because they were so poor and the development was so slow and so on. So as a result, what happened was that all the rich countries got together, plus countries like India, they were there too, and they started out something called the International Development Association. And this is like a trust fund. So the richer countries would pay into this trust fund, and what this trust fund would do, it was administered by the same group that was running the IBRD. It would actually lend to countries or actually even give grants to countries. This was very, very concessional. How concessional? Almost 0% interest, 40-year terms, 20-year grace periods, that kind of thing. Now, for example, it actually has even 60-year loans with 30, 40-year grace periods and so on. So very, very concessional loans. And then there were these two other organizations. One is called Estd, which really had to do with intermediating disputes. And then the last one is called the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. And even a lot of people at the World Bank can't remember that that's what it means, that it means the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. And what this does is that it insures investors against political risks. So if, for example, there is war, or there is, or say that some investor has invested in a firm, but that firm is now being nationalized, you can buy insurance against that. Okay? That is what MEGA stands for. The joke, by the way, I just heard a joke recently. The person who used to be the World Bank representative for India, so his name is Junaid Ahmed. So he got promoted and he became vice president in MEGA, right? And so he actually went to say goodbye to Prime Minister Modi, and Prime Minister Modi said, "Arey bhai, ye MEGA kya hai? You know, what is this MEGA? Ye to pehli bari suna hai naam. You know, I had never heard of this MEGA before." So Junaid told him, "It stands for Make India Great Again." So apparently, actually, the Prime Minister got up from his sofa. He was laughing and he said, "I'll never forget that again. I'll never forget MEGA again." Anyway, that's just a quick story. I'm taking too much time. So these are some of the criticisms against the World Bank and the IMF over the years. One of them was that when the IMF and the World Bank helped countries get out of trouble in Africa, they often asked these countries to do things that didn't work and sometimes made things worse. Okay? So these were called the structural adjustment programs, because if you remember, I told you that if you ended up having a big, to the extent that you had a big imbalance on your current account, you needed to fix policies as well. And so so basically what was happening was that the World Bank and the IMF were giving advice to these countries, medicine to these countries that wasn't working. It was sometimes killing these economies. So that was the first one. The second one was when Latin American countries got into trouble, the World Bank and the IMF were associated with something called the Washington Consensus. And this was, what should Latin American countries do to get back on their feet? Because the Latin American countries had got into a huge debt crisis. They actually had to be helped by the US government, but also by the World Bank and the IMF. And so that package of things that people thought they should do is called the Washington Consensus, and so on, right? But right now, the big problem right now is that what has happened is that the world has changed a lot, as you can see from this chart. And one of the big things that has happened, of course, is that if you look at the green line there, that green line is the share of Europe. And the share of Europe from 1960 has gone from about 25% to about 15 or 14%. It's gone down a lot. If you look at the US, it's gone from about 33% to 23%. And then if you look at the other lines, you sort of see is that there's this red line that you see, that is the share of China, which has gone from about 2% to 18.2%. And then if you look at that light blue line, you actually sort of see that's where India is, okay? So the shares of India and the share of India and the share of China has been going up. So basically, Asian countries have a much bigger share now, and the countries of the North Atlantic have a much smaller share. But if you look at the voting shares in the World Bank and the IMF, those have not changed that much. So this is the big controversy right now. I'm going to stop here and ask Shomi to come and talk with you about the World Development Report. Yeah. And I can answer your questions afterwards. Both Shomik and I can answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Indermit. Good evening, friends. It's really exciting to be here with you this evening. I realize it's a Friday evening. You may have exams to study for, and you may have other things to do. So when we came to campus today, I learned so many things that are highly related to this year's World Development Report that we are producing. The focus of the World Development Report is on the middle income trap. And the middle income trap is an idea that as economies start growing beyond low incomes, they start slowing down. And they start slowing down because the drivers of growth that got them from low incomes to middle incomes, they ran out of steam. And so they kind of are stuck with structures that are no longer suitable for them. So that's when I came here to IIT Madras today, I just loved it because your story is exactly the sort of story that can help an economy go beyond middle incomes. So what did we learn? We learned that the establishment of IIT Madras was in collaboration with German technology. So there were ideas on the global frontier. And India at that time was investment scarce, but also know-how scarce. And to get the Indian economy infused with global engineering talent and global capabilities, ideas had to come from somewhere else. And this sort of collaboration brought the best of German engineering into building a whole generation of engineers who could advance India's economy. So the idea here is that countries need to change their structural pattern by bringing by infusing global ideas and diffusing them. The second thing that IIT Madras did was that it did not focus on theory, it did not focus on pure innovation, it focused on changing the structure of industry. So it was very practical. So it was using infused talent to empower Indian industry to start doing things differently. And that's the second thing that we find is that countries, especially in East Asia, when they brought in global ideas, they didn't just make it academic exercises. They worked closely with industry and rolled these ideas out so that local industry became capable to compete in global markets. And I'll tell you a few examples on that. The third part of the story was the selection of people, of you young people, into these institutions is based on your merit. It's not who you are, it's not where you come from, it's not things that have to do with your neighborhood or others. It has to do with the talent you have. And that's another thing that we find and argue in the report, that economies do well when they start rewarding merit of people, especially merit of women. And it's encouraging to see even in the IIT system, the share of women enrolling and graduating is increasing. And the final part is that there are some parts of the programs you do in IIT that are beating global standards. Because you have mastered how to do things, infuse things, you figured it out, you're doing it better than anyone else. Your colleagues today showed us the labs where you and others are competing in space competitions, in underwater competitions, in building solar-powered cars, and you're probably going to do this better than anyone at the global frontier. Now that's when there's a whole range of innovation. But that innovation comes only after you have mastered infusion. So those were some things really central to your model that kind of helped me understand that what we were doing in this report was probably telling part of your story. So what I will do, and I'll take exactly 5 minutes because I want you to ask questions of Indermit, is tell you a little bit about what we do in this report so that when it comes out later this summer, you'll be able to kind of engage with it with much more excitement. So what we do in this report is look at the growth prospects of the 108 economies in the world that the World Bank classifies as middle income. And they include countries like India, they include countries like China, and there's a whole range of incomes that this grouping classifies. And what we have found, that countries get to middle income. They reach middle incomes with a lot of push towards investment, but then they get stuck. And very few make it to high incomes, and the World Bank defines these high incomes around $13,000 per capita. And over the last 34 years, only 34 countries have been able to transition from middle income to high income. The combined population of people living in those 34 countries is 250 million people. That's it. That's like the population of a country that's our neighbor. And so what we have found is that it's been very difficult for countries to make this transition. And now with global headwinds, where trade patterns that drove growth for so many years is being fragmented, and the accumulation of debt in a lot of countries, these possibilities are getting even harder, right? But the fundamental issue that countries need to think about is to shed the growth model that worked for them to bring them from low income to middle income. Because what worked from you earlier on is not going to work for you as you chart a course towards the future. Think about it. You're driving at 100 miles an hour, and you're looking into the rear view and seeing how fast you can drive. You're going to crash. So something needs to change. And that change is what we call the 3 I's of economic growth. The first fundamental I is investment. And a lot of countries are doing investment. But say, right now the average middle income country has capital endowments that is 75% of the US. The US is considered the technology frontier because they're only, and also the economic frontier, because there are only about 100 million people who live in countries that are richer than the US. And here what we see, even with 75% of capital endowments, incomes are closer, or per capita GDP per worker is 25%. So the reason here is that more you invest, the less you get out of it. Diminishing returns kicks in. So something needs to be done to amplify the returns to investment. And what is it? And here, many of you would think, hey, it's got to be innovation. We're going to come up with new stuff. What we're saying, no. First, you have to add to investment infusion of global ideas, take this to your local economy, and diffuse them at scale. And when you have mastered the way in certain parts of the economy to infuse, then you add the 3rd I, which is innovation, which is frontier technologies and frontier ideas. So in the 1970s, the global frontier of knowledge was the US. Today, the global frontier of knowledge has moved towards Asia, notably Korea, and also China. And so how do countries engineer these sorts of changes of mixing and calibrating investment, infusion, innovation in the economy? And here we look at the middle part of the report, and you will all find this very exciting. We use ideas of creative destruction. These are the ideas that economist Joseph Schumpeter defined these gale forces of creative destruction, where entrants and new players in an economy, they destroy outdated arrangements and bring new ideas and practices into your economy. And what we provide here is a new way to look at creative destruction, or more broadly, a different way to look at creative destruction. If any of you have read Schumpeter, I don't know how many, but you get a very dark view of the world. And the dark view of the world is that people who are incumbents, who have established positions in the economy or in society, they're ganging up with each other. They're colluding. And they're blocking any new entrant from coming and gaining market share. That's one view of it. And today that one view works really well for the energy sector, where state-owned enterprises, they produce most of the fossil fuel generation in middle-income countries, and most of the renewable energy comes from private enterprises. And the state-owned enterprises not only own generation, they own the transmission lines, they have power purchase agreements, they've got networks locked in. All of you are buying cars or have bought cars that run on fossil fuels. So this becomes a very kind of Schumpeterian view in the traditional sense. But there's another view to it, a less gloomy view, where incumbents, they can block progress, but they don't collude with each other. Newcomers can always come with new ideas and make changes. And here this applies largely to the allocation and the development of talent. And here particularly the talent of women. Think about the United States. If United States had gender discrimination at the levels of which it was in the 1960s, the United States economy would be 30% smaller. But because of regulations and practices that improve gender parity, the US economy has done much better. So again, there's a power of getting people whose talent was not recognized and valued a real place in the economy. And finally, is a new view of creative destruction where incumbents alongside entrants can make change and add value. And that's sort of the modern view that some of our colleagues like Ufuk Akçit, who is a professor at Chicago, he kind of works with, to show that incumbent firms, they have a great incentive to make progress happen because they have the human capabilities, they have the resources to put into fixed capital, and given the right competitive pressures, they can make change. So what we do in the report is carefully examine 3 decades or over 3 generations of theory on creative destruction. And then what we crystallize is why and how countries need to change their growth strategy from focusing too much on investment to recalibrating the roles of infusion and innovation like you are doing. And then we apply these ideas to look at enterprise, to look at talent, and to look at emissions. And finally, we have a policy section where we say, how do we really make incumbents advance progress? That is by disciplining them, not vilifying them, because they can be good, they can be bad. And how do you distinguish between them is to figure out ways to discipline them. That means keeps the incentives focused and keep them honest so they push the technological frontier. The second thing is, how do we reward merit, especially the merit and talent of people who are kind of not, whose talent was misallocated in the economy. And even with all these good things happening, we know that the forces of preservation in the economy that keep incumbents where they are and keep their position strong is pretty strong if things are going well. It's only when there are moments of crisis that incumbents get weak and the cost of changing incumbency power reduces. Then how do you capitalize on crisis? What do you do? And we have a huge description of today's energy crisis where new sources, where countries can think very carefully about reducing carbon emissions, while for growing countries like India, making sure there's access to energy, and energy is secure, and energy is affordable. In the way, I'm going to stop now and turn it over.
Can you come over?
Yeah, absolutely.
The way that I would summarize how, you have to go from a strategy of 1 I, which is investment at low levels of income, to 2 I's, investment plus infusion. That's what you do when you start to sort of grow into middle income and so on. And then for you to go into high income, you have to add innovation as well. So you go to a 3 I strategy. So India is, roughly speaking, for most of the things in the 2 I strategy, but in some cases it could well be in the 3 I part.
Thank you, sir, for such an informative and insightful lecture. Now I would like to open the stage for audience questions.
Why don't you come here and ask a question?
Or just shout.
Or just say it out from there, right?
I'm Aditya Sharma, and the Student Innovation Lab that you visited, I'm the project manager head for that. So I personally have been working on, my personal experience on the middle income trap has been there in my own family, and seeing that myself, I've been working on more of a personal development based approach. So I'm working on a startup that incentivizes people to work on themselves and develop themselves personally, so they can personally get a higher income, so that leads to a better sort of an ecosystem. So what I wanted to ask is, as you suggested that there are powers in play, one letting others move private or startups into gain control essentially. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, how can these private organizations and startups essentially could get into the industry? And one of the facts is the more larger industries are investing in it, but they aren't getting that much funds back from it either. So I wanted to ask more about the financial side of things.
Take a few questions.
Good evening, sirs. I'm Dhwani. I actually wanted to know, recently we've been hearing news of how a lot of engineers, even in IITs, haven't been getting good jobs and packages. And employment has been getting harder to get in India. So do you think that is a very big factor that something like policy should be focused on right now in India, so that India comes out of the middle income trap? That's my question. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. I'm here. So, thank you so much for the amazing talk. My question is, for countries like India, where population is the biggest concern in terms of why the GDP is so low. And secondly, we have notorious neighbors like Pakistan and China, due to which most of our GDP, or I would say the budget, goes towards security and other concerns. How we can foster innovation and fusion and innovation in countries like India, which is in a situation which is problematic due to its neighbors and population?
Okay, we can take these three questions first, right? So the first one is, I guess my sort of quick way to sort of answer your question about how to sort of improve from a middle income trap personally and so on, is that, the first rule I think is there are no shortcuts. So in the sense that you have to go through certain stages. The same thing is true of countries. So for example, if you have a country like Brazil, which essentially had the same per capita income that India has now, it reached that in the 60s, early 70s. And what it then wanted to do was it wanted to leapfrog straight from there to high income, okay? And along the way, what it ended up doing was it ended up saying, okay, we're going to put a lot of money into innovation, new ideas and so on. And if you just think about it, for a country that has just become a middle income country, it should recognize that there are a whole lot of countries around the world, 30, 40 of them, that have been middle income for a while, that have gone on to high income and so on. They have better technologies and so on. Why should you try to reinvent the wind turbine if somebody's invented it already? Why don't you just get the blueprints of those things and so on? Sometimes it's not just a matter of blueprints. Sometimes it is a matter of sending somebody across, being trained there and so on, and bringing it back. But if your attitude is, no, I'm going to have my own research institutes and I'm going to invent these things from scratch because what I need, I can do it better, or what I need is completely different from what these other countries need. And what you end up doing is that you end up also having policies like higher education policies. You say, I'm not going to invest in everybody. So I will not invest, I will not spread the education budget on primary education. I'm not going to spread it on secondary education. I'm going to train just a few people, like few engineers, few people, because that's all I need, because I'm going to just become an innovator. If you study the experience of Brazil, you realize what a disaster it was. Brazil is still a middle income country, okay? This is more than 50 years later. Brazil ended up becoming one of the most unequal countries in the world. Because remember, if you invest only just in a few people, you leave a lot of other people with low quality or no education, okay? And you end up, having one or two successes like Embraer and so on, but they are the exceptions, not the rule, okay? India did some similar policies back in the 50s and 60s and so on. The IITs were actually part of this thing about, if you haven't, if you invest in IITs, it's great, but you should also be investing in primary education, secondary education and so on, so make sure that everybody is literate, everybody starts to think. So as a result of it, what happened? What happened was that a lot of IIT graduates went abroad because their skills were not really well paid here. So I know that you were talking about the fact that you're not getting good pay packages. Think of these poor guys who are my compatriots who got no job, no pay package, like zero pay package, okay? So they had to go abroad. Now, going abroad is not that easy, right? I mean, in the sense you have to leave your family and your loved ones behind and so on. You have to take all of these risks. But that's what a lot of IIT graduates ended up doing. Remember, they were selected in a very good way. They were selected in a meritocratic way. So they were the top of the top in terms of things. But they were being developed for an economy that never materialized on the other side. Okay? So that's part of the thing. So we say, okay, so India actually ended up missing that stage because India was a closed economy. It did not encourage foreign direct investment and things like that. All that has changed over time. All that has changed since basically the early 90s, right? Because India, remember, because of all of that stuff, India got into such big trouble. Not only was India one of the poorest, had the largest number of poor people in the world, India couldn't manage its own public finances. And so we got into serious trouble in the 1990s. Now, since that time, India has been changing policies and so on. And over the last 10 years, whenever India has had, essentially back then, India switched a lot of these policies, educate everybody, invest in the health of people and so on. Now, so then you say, did India make a mistake to invest so much in the IITs? And the answer is perhaps back then, but it's okay, it's better to make that mistake. The mistake that India didn't make is to prevent IIT graduates from leaving the country. There are some countries that actually try to do that too. Now imagine if somebody who was trained as an IIT Madras engineer and then couldn't get a job and did some job that was non-engineering job. How could that be good for the country? That could not. It was far better to let them go and so on. So India didn't make the second mistake. And now you sort of see, you actually find that they've brought back new technologies, new money, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first part. The second part is that for you to decide whether or not some large firm, because you also hear criticisms, large firms they're too powerful in India, right? And you know who I'm talking about, okay? You say, all right, well, but then if you sort of also look at the cost of accessing the internet through mobile phones and so on, who lowered that cost? Was it a small firm or a big firm? Or was it some combination of a small firm and a big firm, largely? Now, there are other cases in which large firms have prevented. So, for example, when I was growing up in India, we used to have to drive this car called the Ambassador, okay? It was like a boiled egg on wheels, okay? And then you look at the rest of the world is driving around in real cars, and you're driving around in this, awful toy car, which makes a big sound and doesn't move that fast at all, okay? Well, but then that was part of the problem was there were some big firms that were making a lot of money on that because you had tariffs and so on. As a result, India probably didn't do well on automotive engineering. We now say, oh, we are not good at manufacturing and so on. You end up losing a lot because you had that policy where you kept out foreign technologies for a long time. Very hard to catch up then, but we are catching up, so that's the thing. So the main point is, don't think about large firm as bad. Because, for example, we went to the incubator center. They were being sponsored by some very large firms, okay? Which means that they are actually encouraging innovation, right? So, but then what we say in the report is we say, we've been focusing on the wrong indicators when we are talking about policy. It should not be about the size of the firm. It should be about something else. What is that? We call it value added. And we actually show in the thing. The example that Shomik was giving, he was saying that if you look at a country that does investment well, okay, what it does is it ends up having, you can get to a level of investment that is close to 70% of that of a US, of the amount of capital that a US worker works with. But that worker will only be 20% as productive. Why? It's because they're not using the right technologies, okay? So that's the other thing. So you have to bring those technologies from abroad. So you have to, now the other thing that we sort of say is there is a lot of, there are a whole lot of complaints about inequality. So, you know, inequality is rising, inequality is rising. If China had done that, because inequality started to rise in China, remember under communism there was almost no inequality at all. Everybody was poor. China had poverty rates of 90%, okay? So when you start to sort of do that, inequality rose. If you focus on inequality, you might get policy right, so on. But you on the other hand, you might say, no, inequality is very bad. I'm going to prevent the rich from getting too rich. But those rich end up becoming world beaters. They end up, you know, you have Huawei and others that have actually done very well across the world, and they brought new technologies into China. And China now has no poverty. China is almost an upper income country, so on. So that's the other thing we said. Don't focus on this static measure called inequality. Look at socioeconomic mobility. How much do people move from low income to middle income to high income in one generation? Okay? Of course, this means that some people move down, and that's life. Some people who are born rich and lazy become poor. But if you're rich and lazy and stupid and you stay rich, you have a problem. You may not have that much of inequality in those countries, but if you have no socioeconomic mobility, you will get policies wrong. So we said focus much more on the socioeconomic mobility. Now, you can tell that the measures that I'm telling you about are less superficial, but they're also harder to get, okay? But the problem, what we are sort of saying is, because of all the things that Shomik was saying, countries like India, which are large, countries like India, which are now trying to develop, do the same sort of thing that China did 2 decades ago, but are now doing it in a very different world, which is much, much harder to grow in. India will have to do it better than China. India will have to do it better than for India to grow to the same levels of per capita income and so on. India is going to get much more resistance. Right? So for all of those reasons, India is going to have to become much more efficient in how it uses capital, much more efficient in how it uses the talent of people, and much more efficient in how it uses energy. So the big message of this report is that a development strategy for middle income is a strategy of total efficiency, okay? And total efficiency demands a lot of information for you to get policy right. If you base policy on the lousy indicators, you will have lousy policy and lousy outcomes. Okay.
I just wanted to have one specific comment on your question. And you had an important question. Why has it been harder for skilled people to get jobs? And I think the World Bank has been doing these surveys called Firm Adoption of Technology. And the firms who adopt new technologies are the ones that have capable managers, that have the incentive and the ability to grow when they're getting productive. But yet what we find in a lot of research is that in many countries such as India, firms are not adopting technologies because there are disincentives to grow. There's a lot of support to keeping firms small and encouraging them to be small, but not, and if they were to grow larger, they are taxed in many ways, as you can understand. And also a lot of firms in India are family managed. They don't have professional managers. And this is well documented in the economic literature. So they don't have that understanding of seeking opportunities and kind of adopting technologies when the need arises. So there are these broader issues, and if you were to Google firm adoption of technologies World Bank, you should be able to see the evidence for India and other countries.
Good evening, and it was a pleasure to hear you both speak on the topic. So my question is basically like, India has been, it's very recent that India has even got into the lower middle income nation with only 2,500 GDP per capita, yet with a $3 trillion economy. So, and as you see, India has been mostly a low-cost labor economy. So how do you see the skill initiatives that has been implemented by the government, be the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, be the Udan Yojana, and how do you see the trends of like the productivity growth, which has been around 5.6? How do you see these trends in productivity growth, the trends in the skill initiatives that could get us out from the middle income trap, and how long will it take to even catch up with our colonizers who are recently been sitting at around $45,000 economy per capita GDP? So how do you see that? How long will it take to catch up with them?
So I had told Shomik not to show the chart that he normally shows about how long it takes to catch up, because it creates all kinds of problems. We should share these slides with everybody. They already have it? Yeah. So he likes this chart and I don't, so I'm going to let him explain it. Go ahead.
So the World Bank has this model called the long-term growth model. They say, if we were to take that countries use their current structural parameters, including its savings rate, its women's participation in the labor force, its investment rates in the recent past, and predict it into the future, what will it take in terms of growing closer to the frontier? And we've done it for pretty much every country in the world, and we show a few countries here. India right now is closer to like 4% or 3% of US GDP per capita. It would take India 75 years to reach 25% of US per capita GDP. It would take a country like Turkey.
It's because the US grows roughly at around 2% every year. So, you know, and steady, period after period. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
It would take China 11 years. But look at those two countries on the bars with red. They are as Indermit would call it, they are the ground zero for the middle income trap, right? They're countries like Brazil and Mexico, which have been in middle incomes for a long time. If anything, they're going farther away from the US frontier. And in the next 49 years, Mexico would be 10% of the US, and in the next 40 years, Brazil would also be 10% of the US. So they're kind of going away. So it takes a long time.
By the way, it's very difficult to translate from this to Viksit Bharat and things like that, because remember, this has to do with a simple measure of it has to do with a relative measure, because you're looking at US GDP per capita and doing it with respect to that. You can have an absolute standard. You can have a standard that says we want to reach 15,000% in 2021 prices, you know, $15,000 in 2021 prices. You can say that, right? And you'll actually get a much shorter period naturally as a result of it. Or you can have something that says we want to attain advanced economy status. And then you have to try to sort of figure out what exactly that means. What is advanced economy status, right? And you can you can define that too. And then you can aim for that and say, we would like to get there by 2047. And you want to set these goals in a way that you're likely not to get there, because you want to be ambitious about it. You don't want to sort of set your goals too low, just like you all. I mean, all of you engineers and others, you should set your sights to be billionaires, not millionaires, you know. You should be billionaires, because you're the top of the top. Like, and so if you don't set your sights high, who will, okay? Let the others set their sights low. You should set high. The point here is simply this. You know, people like me, we've left you a job to do in terms of India. We've left you a much harder job than what even we had 20 years back. Just look at that, you know, how hard it is for China to grow to $13,000 per capita, okay? This was when China was trading a lot with Europe and with the US and so on. This was when China didn't have to worry about emissions and things, right? And this was when China actually had a smaller population than India's, okay? And India did all of that. I mean, India has to do it with all of those things. The good thing is the following. The good thing is that the rest of the world has transited to much smaller, or is transitioning to much smaller populations. So if India actually, to the extent that it's not transitioning to lower populations quickly, India can actually end up being, take a lot of advantage of that. But that's a conditional advantage, right? So you have to sort of make sure that you have an economy that creates jobs. You have an education system that generates talent, okay? And most importantly, that's what we say, this is the part that always gets forgotten. You have an economic system that rewards talent. So if somebody accumulates education, good education and so on, and then they don't get the jobs that their talent actually warrant, they lose, of course, but so does the country, because rich countries tend to have a lot more talent than poorer countries. They tend also to use that talent better than poorer countries. So basically, it's not just a question of catching up with them on the amounts of talent that they have, it's also about catching up. Shomik has this really nice slide actually of the US, if you just show them that, which is, it's a striking slide. I think it's truly an eye-opener to me. So this was a slide of somebody who's done work to see what would be the US GDP per capita. Oh, you don't have it?
I do, it's coming.
You do?
It's coming. Here it is.
Yeah. So basically, that's the US GDP per person, right? Between 1960 and 2010, over 50 years. And what this paper does is it says, if the US had discrimination against women and minorities at 1960 levels, before anti-discrimination legislation and so on, its GDP say that its GDP per person was 100 then, it would have gone up to 260. Okay? So it would have gone up by 60%. Today, US GDP is actually, or in 2010, US GDP actually had more than doubled, okay, to 220. That's the difference in efficiency of allocation of talent. That's the difference. It's massive. Okay? And so if you sort of look at this today, I mean, we can show you another chart and so on. If you look at The Economist, it actually has a really nice survey of India this week. And you sort of see over there, the thing that strikes you about India is the female labor force participation rate is so low. It's like India, Turkey, and others are like half the levels that countries like Korea and Taiwan and China and all these countries have much higher female labor force participation. That's the minimum standard for decent allocation of talent, so that you at least have women being considered in the labor market. Okay. We'll never catch up to China hopping on one foot or running on one leg. Yeah, trying to run on one leg.
As we are short of time, we will end this audience question session here. As we come to the end of today's session, I would like to thank our speakers, Dr. Indermit Gill and Dr. Somik Lal, for the engaging, enlightening session. I request our course, Arjav and Mahesh, to felicitate our guest with the memento. we would request our guest to leave his message for the IITM community in the EML yearbook. With this, we come to the end of this amazing session. We thank each of you for joining us today. Thank you all. Guys, refreshments are outside. You can take. Moment, अच्छा.
Can you email me some of the pictures? Yeah. All right. That'll be
Momento वाला photo परत दे. Momento वाला photo परत.
He wanted to take it again. I wanted to get a copy of some of these pictures. Oh, all right. So let's have a retake of that picture. Sorry, let's remove the bottle.
I request the EML team members to join the dignitary on the stage for a group photo.
All right. Yeah, I think this is my guy.
Come on over here. Come on, guys.
Is it actually not for me? Is it for you?
Okay, why don't we? Okay, and keep it down like the